Do we have people waiting?
401.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Ageless Living Collaborative discussion about small houses. Today we're going to explore the pros and cons of small houses and listen to the experts about the various models of small houses and why they might make sense for your family member or make sense for you as a design opportunity. We'll begin today with, I think, the quintessential question, and that is, what is a small house? How do you define a small house as it relates to senior living? We'll start with Jane Rohde of JSR Associates, and she'll take us into the small house discussion.
Thank you very much, Phoebe. And David, if you could forward the slides, there we go. So Kara Miles, I love her. Isn't she the most beautiful thing ever? And we're going to talk through about small house is a little more complicated. It seems like something that should be very easy. I've had many conversations with my colleagues here about how easy it should be defined and how much more difficult it can be. So we have a couple of typologies, and the residential typology is one that is utilized for one of my clients, and it's basically a residential assisted living. So if you can imagine coming from a residence, adding care, that would be in a residential assisted living or residential typology. Some people might call that a personal care home, a small house in some respects, but it's not coming from a facility side at all. It's coming from a home residential side and adding services to the home. So if you go to the next slide, please.
So Jane, how many people could actually live in a small house?
It depends upon the licensure. So in this case, this is one of my clients, why it's his father-in-law, Frank, and they evaluated various options to look at it, but you could have anywhere from 8 people, which might be considered a licensure of a group home, even though we don't use that nomenclature, but that would be the licensure side. You could have as many as 30 residents in a small house when it's a residential assisted living or residential typology. In Colorado, these are very popular, and they have usually on the average between 16 residents and 30 residents. Whereas in other states, we're working in Indiana right now, and it ranges from 8 to 10 to 12 typically. And so it really depends on the location, the licensing requirements, and what they're looking to do in a residential neighborhood. So most of these are also located on a residential lot. So it's a much different kind of hybrid between care and services and a residential, both a residential zoning and a residential licensure for care. So it's a little complicated, but it's also a very good way of allowing people to live in neighborhoods and residential communities. Next slide, please. I'm just going to show you quickly one that we've been working on that just opened this week. We have some additional photos being taken, but it's 8 rooms, private bathrooms. It has a separation of service between soiled and clean. It also has a laundry, a small care space, a kitchen, great room space, a den that could be used for various things in terms of activities. And it also has a spa and salon. Next slide down, I'll give you a few pictures. We'll show you a few pictures of this. This is Evermore Senior Living. This is a completed home. We're very happy with it. I think that it couldn't feel more residential, so we love that. It's on a site that will allow the adjacent site that is right next to it will provide another home that will be able to be mirrored it, if you will. It'll appear like it's part of the same community, but it'll actually be 2 separate residential sites. In this particular case, we can only have 8 residents per home per residential site based on the licensing code. And then over 4 homes that can be on separate residential sites, you can have 1 administrator. So that's like the goal for the residential assisted living project. And a few interior shots, please.
It looks lovely. It looks like it looks like home. It's very beautiful.
Ding, ding, ding.
Well, you know, and now I would like to bring in Steve Lindsey, who is the CEO of Garden Spot Communities. He is our guest today. And Steve, we thank you and appreciate your joining us for this important conversation about small houses. Steve is an operator and will be able to share some of his side as to who should live in these beautiful small houses, and maybe what the cost, I hope you can shed some light on that as well, Steve, what the cost might be. And so with that, I'd like to ask Steve to jump in.
Yeah, and thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm certainly excited to be here to talk about small houses, about households, whatever nomenclature you want to use, because I think it's really, really critical. One of the interesting things, there was an article that was written recently in June in New York Magazine, and it was entitled "The American Nursing Home is a Design Failure." And I think in many respects, that sounds harsh, but it is very true. And it talks about how, the large institutional traditional nursing homes have really done us a disservice in so many ways. And the COVID-19 world has sort of highlighted a lot of that. But it goes much deeper. And I think as we look at who should be living in those environments, the reality is that it's everyone. If you think about how we live well, how we live in an environment that represents our best selves, it really is in small groups where we have social connections to other people. And on the screen are just a few photos, from our households here at Garden Spot Village in New Holland, Pennsylvania. But you can see there that life is celebrated. It's a smaller group of people who live together and have an opportunity to form relationships with one another. And everything from celebrating Easter dinner all together as a group to more intimate opportunities. One of the things you'll notice is kids seem to always, I was going through pictures the other night looking for some photos, and it was hard to find those without children because, kids are just kind of part of the household. Staff bring their kids, when their husbands come to pick them up, they bring their kids. Families come and bring great-grandchildren along to visit, and it's just such a natural environment that it feels right to have, the toddlers crawling around on the floor playing with toys while all the grandmas are gathered around them.
So you might say it's accidentally multi-generational?
Well, it's accidental and it's intentional. I think you create environments that facilitate the life that you want to live. And so you design for that. And this is an environment that just sort of facilitates the natural opportunity for intergenerational life. Absolutely. There was a book written a couple of years ago, and it was written by a neuropsychologist from UCLA. And they used functional MRIs and other tools to look at how it is that we are hardwired to connect with other people. The book is entitled Social. And one of the interesting things that they found is that we have a region of our brain that is the kind of the social activity center of our brain, and that becomes the default center. And so whenever we stop working on a project, whenever you stop working on your design project you're doing on, or your spreadsheet that you're building or whatever it is, your brain naturally defaults over to social life. Who are the people around me? How do I connect with them? What is my standing with them, and how do I relate? Interestingly enough, that section of the brain begins to fire at the very moment we're born. And it continues all the way through life. We are wired to be social beings. And so a household environment is designed to enable that, to facilitate that. Even in our COVID-19 world, where you go into a more traditional nursing home and people are relegated to their bedrooms, that doesn't need to be the case in a household where people can come out, they can connect. They don't have the kids in right now, but there's relationships. And so I think from nursing homes all the way through assisted living, through even independent living. We have a program here that we developed that was for people who want to live independently, but need a low income alternative, a very affordable alternative. And so we developed something that we call cooperative living or co-living. And it is an opportunity for a group of people to come together and share basically a residential home, not unlike the other images that we've seen there.
Mhm.
But they live independently and share life together, and it gets them away from isolation. So it's just a really phenomenal opportunity for people of all ages. Millennials are drawn to kind of household environment and co-living experiences and so forth.
Well, I would think that there would also be some great health benefits to that. Lisa, do you want to talk to us a little bit about what could be the health benefits? Lisa Sinney from Mosaic Design, part of our Ageless Living Collaborative, is going to speak to this.
Sure. So first of all, you know, Steve, I think the photos of what you had up there show it. They say that loneliness is the #1 killer. And when you're in this type of environment, it's really hard to be lonely. You are around people and they're like your family. And my husband actually has Kemper House of Central Ohio, and this is some of the photos. And we got the pleasure of working on the design and really making it feel like a home. And my niece works there. She's a caregiver. And while she, you know, Ohio State, she's going to Ohio State, and while the dorms were closed, she lived with us. Every night she'd come home and she'd talk to me about Marcia and Martha and Bob and all of these folks and how much she loved them. And it really is a very different environment where the staff becomes like family. And I think part of the health benefit, when you see this, and when you look at the studies, the Journal of American Geriatrics, did a study on 11 different points, and part of it is that you have a better quality of life. The caregivers are like family. They recognize when someone's going to have an issue, maybe before you would if you were in a larger facility. It's important. That little proactive piece is so critical to our health. Some of the other things are when you're
Well, may I interrupt you just a second, Lisa?
Yeah.
Because we actually have 2 questions from our participants today, and I think they kind of go right into what you're talking about. From Kevin, he asks, in the smaller setting, do you find your residents thriving and living longer versus a larger community where there's less interaction with other residents or caregivers?
Probably Steve could answer that a little bit better.
Steve?
Yeah, absolutely. We see people who thrive in that environment, who come to us. And I think one of the issues, and Lisa kind of touched on this a little bit, but one of the issues is we know intuitively that when we lose our sense of purpose in life, we lose the will to live. And I think what happens in a household environment, in a small house environment, is people have an opportunity to contribute to the betterment of those around them. Once again, it can be as simple as setting the table before dinner. It can be as simple. We had one fella who would go into the kitchen after the meals, and he would sweep the floor from his wheelchair, and it would take him a long time, but that was his way to contribute, to give back. And when you have that opportunity to give back, to really pour yourself into the lives of other people, it inspires you and it inspires others, and it keeps you wanting to live, and it keeps you wanting to push on. And I think that's huge in terms of just the quality of life and the longevity of life that you live. And then there's other things, just as simple as nutrition. People eat better when they're in a household environment. They can smell the great picture of the kitchen there, where it's all open to the rest of the household. You can smell the meal being prepared. You can hear the normal sounds of life in the kitchen, you know, the dishes clattering and the mixer going and all those kind of things. And it just naturally cues you that the meal is coming, that you prepare for that. And so people tend to eat better because it's freshly prepared right there, and they can have a great meal with friends and family and visitors and so forth. You can practice hospitality. It continues to inspire people to live, and so they really do live longer.
And don't you think too, Steve, that normalization, like just that normalization of daily life, you know, so people are often judged by their diagnosis, and this has nothing to do with diagnosis, but the part of the person who's living. And we happen to have care services that are also delivered as part of that. But it starts to normalize their everyday, which I think is so essentially important, because I think that's missed often. It's looked at as a clinical process instead of a living process.
And just to jump in.
I have another question that just came in that is, I'm not sure who wants to answer this, but since elder people do very well with kids, would it make sense to compare it with a daycare center, reading stories, learning, knitting, etc.? I think seeing all those photos of kids probably generated this photo or this question. Who would like to speak to that?
Well, I think from a designer that's had daycares in some of our small homes, that they're connected. It's not the same thing, but there is a great synergy between kids and elders. I think there is something special about when you get to the season in your life where you can really appreciate and slow down and be patient with a kid trying to explain his words to you, or just be mesmerized by some little toy. There's something special when a senior is able to really meet a kid where they are, and that interaction you don't get when you're going about your life and you're, running about and doing things. And it's very beneficial for both the senior and the child. So anytime we can integrate those things and put them on the same campuses, I think it's a fantastic thing to do.
That makes perfect sense to me. I know that my mother, when she was quite elderly, would prefer to have my son, for instance, explain electronics to her as opposed to me, because he could meet her at a level that was better. He had more patience, apparently. So I think that there are a lot of lessons that can be learned on that. We touched on briefly early on, and I want to go back to that for a second. Health benefits. And I believe, Steve, you said early on something about COVID kind of brought a few of these things to life. I know, Lisa, you have discussed with me separately in the past how small houses have some health benefits that maybe other senior living communities don't necessarily have or have to that extent. Would you like to touch on that a bit?
Sure. Part of it is falls. There's a huge fear of falling in the senior population. And the studies show that there is a reduced incident of life-threatening falls. People will fall, but part of that is understanding medication, having a mental where you're not in a fear mode. There's a lot of psychology behind it that you're afraid you're going to fall. When you're in a small home, you don't have that as much. You're not walking by yourself as much. You don't feel like you have to walk miles down to the dining room, and if something happens, you need to take a break or someone would not know. Everyone's there and integrated. You're also exercising more because you're in a home environment. You're probably, and Steve could probably speak to this a little bit, but you're not going to be able to just sit and sleep in your room all day long. That's one of the things. And what we know that exercise is a huge deterrent of falls. The other thing is natural light. And the best form of vitamin D that you can have is natural light. Small homes are incredible for having natural light. And then I believe, Jane, you had brought up before when you and I were talking, and then I looked into the research, the greenhouse, the incident of COVID was so much less in the small homes than it was anywhere else.
Right. So the contrast was, thousands of differences in terms of numbers, and a very, very small ratio. And part of that is dedicated staff. I also think that that's a big part of the play. I think people have said, oh, it's the nursing home system. And I'm like, well, it's partially the nursing home system that's created it because of not paying potentially a living wage in certain settings. So if people work in multiple settings, that then can relate to having more exposure. And a larger facility with mixed staff that are working throughout a very large facility can also add to that. So this opportunity of the Greenhouse Project's been doing monthly updates on their research, and the deaths are very small, and the spread of infection is very small. And it's still considered a home, right? Like Steven said, so people can still interact, because the isolation that's occurring otherwise, as my 80-year-old mom would say, it's going to far kill them sooner than COVID-19 ever will. And that's coming from an 80-year-old's perspective that said, you shouldn't isolate those old people, because she's not one of them.
Well, she certainly knows that. I have a question. I'm looking at all these people, and I'm looking at the collection of people in the houses and the kids. how do you know that certain folks are going to match up with the other people in the house? What's the equation for success on that?
Voting off the island, you mean?
Yeah. Like, how do we know? How do we know that, Mrs. Smith is going to get along with Mrs. White, and that Mr. Jones is going to not just, want to isolate in his bedroom because, these two are impossible. What is the equation in a small house where I would think a sense of community and a give and take is far more important, right, than in a much larger community? How do you make that mix work? Steve, do you want to tackle that?
Yeah, I can certainly speak to that. I know at our community, we tend to be very full in terms of occupancy, so there's not a lot of opportunity. If we have, a bedroom that's available and we have somebody who needs that, they tend to get plugged in. And so the question is, how are people going to relate? And there's some things that I think we do that help lead to deeper formation of relationships than is otherwise the case. One of those is using learning circles. And so when a new person arrives in the household, the staff will facilitate a learning circle where everyone comes out into the household, and in normal days, oftentimes their family members will join them, and you learn the story about the new person who's come in. And so you get to know them in a more significant way than we would otherwise. And when we know somebody and we know their heart and we know their passion and their interest and their background and their history, we tend to be a little more forgiving of some of those little idiosyncrasies that might otherwise agitate us. And so we
So
see.
you're saying that maybe we all should have those learning circles.
Well, I'm thinking it might not hurt. But what we see is we will have people who are living with dementia commingled in with people who are cognitively intact. We have people who come in for short-term rehab that will be commingled in with longer-term residents, in that environment. And somehow it all seems to work because of the environment and because it feels less institutional, so people aren't on edge already. And because they have the same people around them day in, day out, they start to look out for one another and they start to care about one another, and they enjoy, having dinner together, and they look forward to, somebody's grandson coming in, for dinner that day, or all of those special kinds of, they share family as well as sharing life. And so we find that people tend to be a lot more forgiving when they really know the people that they're sharing life with in a household.
Absolutely.
Maybe I think that part of it is, I grew up in an Italian family, and every Sunday we had dinner, and my grandmother would have everyone there, and I thought they were all my relatives, but they weren't. Some of them were boarders. A lot of these seniors grew up where you had someone that was living with you because economically it wasn't easy to just have the houses by yourself. So the senior lifestyle is a little bit more community than maybe Gen X is, where we would have to think through it, or how someone has went into a college situation. But I think it's a little bit easier than most people think.
Well, I wonder though about the small house difference when it comes to staffing, for instance, because it's got to be adjusted for a small house versus a larger community. And how do you do that so that those people, the staff then kind of move seamlessly within this almost tight-knit community that's been formed because of the size and the nature of the house? Steve?
Yeah, certainly many of the roles or the responsibilities are the same. You still have to have caregivers there, as Lisa mentioned earlier. You have to have nurses, sometimes respiratory therapists. All of that clinical team has to be there. You still have to have people who are cooking and cleaning and all those kind of things. But the way we align those roles and responsibilities tends to be a little bit different. And there's a lot of variation in how that gets executed at different communities. And the freedom of that is really significant because it lets you create a model that really works with your community and works in your culture. And so the greenhouse models have a universal worker. They refer to them as a shabazine, and that universal worker does all the caregiving and all the cooking and all the cleaning. At our community, we have what we call blended role workers. So we have our caregivers have their responsibility on the clinical side, and then we have homemakers that do the cooking and cleaning, and it allows them to kind of devote all their energy to those kind of responsibilities. But Jane mentioned a really key aspect to that, and that's having permanent assignments, having dedicated staff. And so it's the same people who are working with the same residents day in, day out. And they truly get to know those people in a deep and meaningful way, and they start to care about them. And so it really leads to a more fulfilling work experience for the workers. It leads to deeper relationships with between all the parties involved in the household. It leads to less turnover, so you don't
That's
have
always a good thing.
staffing crises that we typically do in skilled nursing. We have actually never had agency staffing or temporary staffing in our buildings since we've gone to the household model. It hasn't been necessary. When there's a gap in staffing, when there's a need there, staff step in and fill that because they know who they're caring for and why that's important, because they love them, they care about them.
Right.
And so
does
it just
that mean,
creates a different environment.
are the regulations different in the small houses versus the larger communities, or are they the same?
Yeah,
Depends.
very same regulations. Yeah, it's all the same requirements and all of the same responsibilities. It just gives you an opportunity to fulfill those in a little bit different way.
So these all sound like really positive reasons to live in a small house. Yeah, I think it sounds engaging. Everybody has a chore if you want one. You know the people who are coming in every day. Sounds quite wonderful. So tell me, what's the downside? Are there any downsides? Am I missing something here?
I guess I could take that one a little bit. So when you asked about the licensing, so you can do small houses in assisted living, you can do them in independent living, you can do them in nursing homes, you can do them in all different licensed and unlicensed settings. So that's something to kind of be aware of when we talk about residential assisted living versus, say, a household or a small house. And I think with that in mind, when you ask about the pros and cons, here's an example of a household here. If in terms of it being part of a larger community, similar to how Steve's is assembled. But if you're looking at it from the opportunity of the downside, so when we work with certain communities and certain clients, they can only achieve what their staff and the management and everyone is willing to change the culture. So if the culture becomes difficult to change, what we have found, we've done things like duplexes, we've done things like all different kinds of varieties of households and small houses based on what the client, the existing staff base, the residents, what they can handle, because sometimes people can't completely decentralize. Steve's done a wonderful job of completely decentralizing dining. Everything happens in the household. Others cannot get their minds around it. This is actually from Steve's place too, and it's one of my favorites because those three ladies just get to choose everything that they want to do in terms of
They look
when
very
they get up,
happy.
what cup they get to use, and that's the upside of choice, right? But when you get to a community that can't necessarily manage that, you want to give them a successful built environment, right? So if you give them a built environment that's a small house that has completely decentralized services, that's not going to work for them if they're going to try to operationalize it more from an institutional or a facility base. So you have to meet them in terms of where their comfort level is. We have a tendency of pushing pretty hard to get to a different kind of care model, but the culture has to shift. And what we found on one community is that we had one nurse manager that was amazingly supportive of greenhouse, small house, household model. She left about 3/4 of the way into the process. And we didn't have two other people who were as strong advocates as she was. So things started to come apart. And so during the construction, we had a resident, independent living resident, who filmed the entire construction process. She was an amazing little woman, Jane Heald. And she would call me and say, hey, we got a problem. And we would try to solve it and like preempt it so that they still had the household where they could all come together, regardless of whether they lived in assisted living, independent living, or part of the nursing home. So it's trying to help the client see where they can go to make person-centered care as the primary point of contact. And then
So do you
take
think
from there
that's,
what they can do.
do you think that's, I mean, I think what you just said about somebody taking charge and reaching out for the betterment of the community, it sounds like people step up and treat these small houses like they are their homes, not just where they reside, but they are their homes, and they're involved in the continual evolution of them, and making sure that it is right for everybody. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think so. Don't you, Steve?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And that will happen as much as leadership allows it to happen. And so one of the things we talk about is kind of organization as machine, where it's hierarchical and everyone is a cog in the machine, so to speak. You know, the typical old style way to view healthcare. And the opposite of that is organization as organism, where it's flexible, where it's adaptable, where it's empowered. One of the things we work really hard to do is push decision making down to the, you know, the level that's closest to the recipient of care as possible. And so obviously, you know, the teams in a household in a small house can't make all the decisions, but they can make a lot of them, and they can make the decisions that make a difference in their lives and in the lives of the people they're serving and living with there. And so, you know, to have not only that freedom, but that responsibility leads to empowerment and ownership. And so it really does cause people to be much more invested in the life of the household.
Well, you just talked about involvement, and I have a question from one of our viewers. Do residents get involved in meal planning and preparation?
They do. In fact, I was in one of our areas just a few days ago, and I was helping to assist one of the residents with her meal, and talking to another resident as I was doing that, and we were talking about they had fresh corn on the cob that day. They had helped to husk it and, you know, kind of get it ready for the meal. And we were talking about how great the corn is, you know, this time of year and everything. And we started talking about other things. I was talking, we'd make corn fritters, and she said, oh, that's great, but it splatters, you know, when the corn pops. She says, have you ever made corn pie? And I said, no, I haven't, but it sounds wonderful. I've heard of it. And so the homemaker, who was kind of moving around in the kitchen and out in the dining room during that time, she says, oh, I've got a great recipe for corn pie. If you like corn pie, we'll make corn pie next week. And
Wow.
so, you know, that's just kind of the natural sort of evolution of life. Breakfast is made to order whatever you want, which seems impossible to manage, except the homemakers really get to know the tastes and preferences of the people that they serve. And so they stock the kitchen with the things that that group of people like to have. And so it becomes a very natural part to get together and talk about, what are we going to have next week for dinner? You know, fresh peaches are coming in. What should we do with the peaches? And how do we want to do that? And, oh, you have a recipe for that? Let's use your recipe and make it. And do you want to help?
I love it. It sounds very much like the way that my son is in college, and he lives in an off-campus house, and it's kind of that everybody's taking a role at doing their part, right? So, you know, what are you cooking today? Well, what would you like me to cook? I've never done this before, but do you have an idea? It sounds like it comes back all over again. It's a recycle of the way we behaved at one time before, maybe. I have another question from a manufacturer for architectural millwork who says, I see the refined residential design. Do you experience a different wear on the product that goes beyond the typical residential cabinetry supply?
We do.
Anyone?
So it's so evaluation of product is tricky because you want it to look like home, feel like home, be home. However, there are some things that make it a little bit more challenging. And I think that making sure that the product can withhold, well, you also have COVID, so it's kind of like an additional filter that we didn't always have before. So
Mhm.
cleaning and disinfecting chemicals and making sure that touch points are cleaned and disinfected. So we have a kind of a handful of manufacturers that we like to use, and then most of them have some residential background, but more in the more of a commercial wherewithal when it comes to standards, and also sizing. Sizing actually has more to do with it than anything, because if you have something that's too deep and too low and someone can't get out of it by themselves, that could create a dependence or problem with needing a staff or another person tries to help them up. However, there's a balance between risk and safety, and I'm going to give that one to Steve.
And
Yeah,
performance, I would think. We're going to put performance in there.
yeah, that balance really is critical. You know, we have typically focused so much on keeping people safe that, you know, we kind of have them in this bubble and we don't let them live fully. And so you want to have an environment where folks are free to knock around, they're free to live life, and are free to do the things that you know that make them live fully and give them purpose and give them meaning and passion in life. That's what we all need. And so sometimes that does involve risk, and it does involve doing things that we might think, you know, that's not going to be good for them. It's going to be there's a level of caution that needs to occur there. But you work through that in a small house environment. And when you're doing care planning, you talk about those things and you allow them a voice. If they understand the risks and their family understands the risks and they're willing to take that because they know it's meaningful, that's really critical. In terms of millwork and how that performs, it does mean that it's a pretty hard environment. People bang around a lot on stuff. You know, somebody might be moving around in their wheelchair and not be particularly safe with that, but they're, you know, scraping into walls, scraping into cabinetry, all those kind of things. Access to the kitchen is really important, and so we need to have environments that are welcoming but also, you know, locations where you can lock down certain elements of that and keep folks safe. The infection prevention stuff that Jane talked about is all really important, but you have to have an environment where people can do the things they want to do, where they can live the way they want to live and make the choices that matter to them.
So maybe they'll take a little risk. We have another question. I'm so happy that we have such an engaged audience today. Joe Lopez asking us, what is the average square footage of the size of these communities? And second part of the question, how do they differ from tiny houses or even a smaller size community? If it is the freedom of choice or the social programs. So is it the freedom of choice or the social programs that maybe draws people to these communities? But if somebody can take this average size piece, because I've now seen images of larger and smaller. So is there kind of an average?
Depends.
It depends.
So yeah, so we worked on the project we just opened this week. It's 5,500 square feet per house, and that's for 8 residents. And they're all individual small houses in terms of being separate residential assisted living. So when you look at that piece, there you go, that's the picture of it. You're definitely talking about a much smaller square footage. Whereas if you have multiple households that are connected with a link or are part of a larger community, like Steve's are all interconnected with the assisted living component, your beautiful community space that you have, and your independent living, they're all kind of come together. So it really depends on what you're doing, what your care population is, who you're serving, how many people you're serving, and then that would work from the square footage accordingly. Does that sum it up, Steve, pretty good for you guys?
Yeah, I think one thing to add just from a design perspective is that it's easy to make them too large, and that's not necessarily a good thing. One of the things that really makes a small house work is that level of intimacy, of that feeling of being at home where you're kind of cocooned, where you have, things, that feel familiar, that look familiar, that the scale is familiar. And so it's sometimes the harder challenge is to keep it sized correctly for the number of people that are going to live there and not build the spaces too large.
Steve,
I
I
know
think that's brilliant that you said that, because quite often when operations gets involved, they want everything extremely large and easy for them, and that's not an intimate space for the folks that are living there.
Mhm.
And if you
Agreed.
think of everything with that home scale, like, so that's always our filter, right? It's like, would you do that at home?
Exactly,
There's
100%.
like, no, I never do that at home. So I think that gives you a good filter for determining it, but it then depends on how your monetary side works for your model too. You might have to have X number of residents, and how many residents makes it work for you in terms of financially, where you are geographically, the level of care that you're providing, the acuity of the resident. There's so many different factors that takes that in, but I agree, small is better.
Well, can we discuss the geographical for a second? Because it appears from looking at the imagery that these are probably not necessarily in urban environments. Would that be an accurate assessment?
They can be. The slide before was in Columbus, Ohio. So I've done ones in very urban environments and also out in the country. I don't think that the programming of it makes it have to be defined that it's a suburban product.
Okay.
or you have access to it. This is a neighborhood that's in Columbus, and this one's in Cincinnati. The other one that's coming up is in Canada. It really it's about more the programming on the interior and the access to light and nature. This was in Canada. So I think that you have a lot of flexibility here. That's the great thing about interior design. Is that people experience the architecture, the exterior architecture, for a couple minutes. They experience the interior for 98% of their time, I think, or a little bit maybe higher.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that for us, for the urban environment, because we've been working on multi-generational communities, and so same concept, same care model, same ideas, just in a stacked format, right? So if it does have to be on an urban type site, how do you provide, we find the challenge probably the most would be to get the access to green space. So we build that in from the beginning, because if you don't put it in from the beginning, it gets excluded. So it's nothing like running through the program and you're looking at the rooms that people are saying they want and everything, and then there's no outdoor space, and then, oh yeah, outdoor space. And it's always like during construction documents when it doesn't occur. So we always put that right in that upfront programming process to make sure that that gets included, so that it's just like any other program space, and it's just as important as everything else. And then however you're working with your various populations, or even outside, outside community vendors. I mean, you could easily have outpatient rehab, or a home healthcare agency, or something else that's actually a component of your community as well. But it doesn't change the care modeling process in terms of that. It just changes the physical part. And I like what Lisa said about the interior, because we do spend most of our time to the interior, so it's important.
Right. Well, and if you look at these images, it looks like somebody's home. So tell me, how do you design differently for senior living? Because that could be, somebody's house that I walk into. That's not a small house. So
I love that. I love that you think that, because that's the litmus test, right? Is that for all the furniture manufacturers, when we work together, and they're showing me pieces, and to Jane's point, like, we'll say, hey, we need to have, the seat at a proper height, and I need to have the arms, and I need to have the durability.
Mhm.
And then they often would give me a piece that I would never put in my own living room.
Mhm.
And if I'm not going to sit in my own living room, how can I expect my grandmother to do that? She has to be able to be comfortable. There is a balance between that. And that's the beauty of senior living manufacturers, is they understand the blend between residential and commercial. And they really do a fantastic job of it. And then we're able to integrate, maybe some antiques, or more residential pieces that wouldn't get as much wear and tear. Like if you see here, lamps and tchotchkes, and just a space I would want to sit and hang out with my family. So,
Absolutely.
this is kind of the point. And, there's lots of design challenges that you have to go through. We use the LOVE method, which we talk about light, optimize, visual, and ease. There some of the challenges that designers don't often think about in a small home, and that I've realized, because after, you make mistakes. That's the only way you get to be a good designer. So having light bleed in to rooms from the hallways, because it is a 24-hour operation. The caregivers and staff have to support you 24/7 in there. So that means lights are going to be on. So when you're in your bedroom, you don't want to be seeing light come through with, someone down the hallway. Noise, you don't want to hear everybody out. If you went to bed, you don't want to hear the TV on. It's no different than when you're in your home with your family. You need to feel like you can have your own privacy in your own room, and everybody can't hear your business.
Let me ask you, you just brought up a bedroom. So when you go to independent living and senior living, you often take your own furniture for your apartment. What happens in a small house with your bedroom? Are you bringing your own furniture, or is that furniture already there for you?
Same thing.
Okay, so it varies.
It varies. A lot of people bring their own furniture. It's what they're comfortable with. Some folks will say, you know what, my husband passed and I want to get a new suit. I had the same thing since we got married, and I want to get a twin bed. I'd feel more comfortable in it, and you get an opportunity to kind of upgrade, and the family goes out and decorates. And Steve, you've probably had this experience before. So it goes both ways, but it should be not an institutional thing. It should be the resident's choice. It can even be, I think, Jane, you had brought this up, being able to choose a paint color in the room, and how that has increased people's, ability to feel like it's their place.
And I think that not only the selection of that, but I remember being a very young designer working in a CCRC, and I came off the elevator in a brand new building that had really become mine, right? It had nothing to do with anyone else because I was so involved with it. And someone had brought one of those old flowered yellow gliders and had put it in the hall. And I was like, oh, I was like completely horrified. And then I was like, oh no, it's their home, right? So I really kind of had to learn and back off that when they wanted to add something, or they would take over little segments of the different parts of the community, became theirs. So you got used to some of the most interesting tchotchkes or artwork, and people would want to flip out artwork. One woman wanted to take the whales and give it to her grandson and put up a different painting in the hallway. I thought it was fine until when I got a phone call, it said, "What happened to my whales? That's how I know where my apartment is." So, so there's all these kind of personal integration parts of letting it be theirs, and also checking with the neighbor before you remove the artwork.
It's a fine balance. I think you, as a designer, you have a tendency to go Frank Lloyd Wright, and you want to nail down the furniture and make everything look pretty. And I've actually heard some designers gluing down the accessories, and I'm like, well, I don't do that in my house, so why would I do that here? I think it's that balance.
Before we wrap up, and we're going to do that in just a few minutes because this hour has gone by so quickly and there's been so much great information. So I thank all of you. I'd also like to have a special shout out to David Ashen of Dash Design, who is working behind the scenes today. He is typically part of our Ageless Living Collaborative panel, but he is doing the back of house with the imagery for all of us today. So thank you so much, David. It's been so seamless. Before we wrap up, I want to take one final word from each of you. Jane, small houses, final word.
Go small house.
Small house. Okay, Steve.
Yeah, I think just keying off, the previous conversation, home is where your stuff is, and if you have a place, if you create an environment where people can keep their stuff in their bedroom, and where they can live life fully and with meaning and purpose. That's our goal. That's what we want to accomplish. And I think a small house does that better than anything else I've seen.
Lisa.
This isn't a prescriptive thing. There's no perfect way to do it. It's got to work for how your staff, your families, the residents, and your community is. So people they hear one thing and then they want to take and implement, and if it fails, they think it doesn't work. That's not the case. There's a million ways to do this. Just, follow your heart and again, create home.
Thank you all for sharing your insight today. I think this has been a tremendously valuable experience for everybody who has dialed in or gone on the web. I know for me, I'm pretty convinced that a small house is the way I want to go when I one day get old. But thank you so much for sharing your time and insight. Steve, thanks for joining our group today, and we hope to welcome you back in a webinar coming up soon.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Guys,
Mhm.
bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.